a chat with Sue earlier in the week, and I was saying that Sue's the person who hasn't got a double-barreled surname that we've done in these interviews, but she has got a very front-loaded title, which is Baroness, Dame, Professor, Sue Black. So we'll talk about all of those titles a little bit later on. She's a fantastically interesting forensic anthropologist, and if you don't know what that involves, will imminently. I've been reading your book, and I wanted to start with a quote. It's a quote which I think you wrote the job of the forensic anthropologist is not to create a life story, but to try to find and understand a story that's already been written large in its bones, muscles, skin, and tendons. So explain the work of the forensic anthropologist, and you work with all the ologists who you might have been friends with like the past.
So the most common question is, what's the difference between a forensic pathologist and a forensic anthropologist? And the biggest difference is about £100,000 in salary is the difference. But the other side of it is the pathologist will tell you the manner of death and the cause of death. The anthropologist tells you who was that person when they were alive. And most of us will die where we expect to die. We will die in a hospital, or maybe in our cars, or maybe in our bed, and our identity is not brought into question. But when you die, perhaps in a remote place, and your body is found a long time later, or you're involved in a mass fatality event, whether it's the World Trade Center, London bombings, any of these mass fatality events, our job is to say, who is the person? And sometimes when we're working in war crimes, the importance of who is the person is that if you're prosecuting somebody for genocide, for example, as we did with Milosevic, is to say we need to show that the people who have lost their life are not combatants. So they're women, they're children, they're elderly, and that supports the charge of genocide. So sometimes we're supporting the courtroom and the justice system in terms of has a crime been committed. But much of the time when it's about identity, it's about being able to say to somebody, I'm sorry, it is your wife, it is your father, and I'm afraid here is the body this now allows you to bury, to go through the processes, and perhaps to get on with life. So we're about who were you when you were alive? And you write your story in your body every single day. You are a product of everything that you eat. So the only way you can create the bones and the muscle and the skin is by what you put in through your mouth, because that's where those minerals come from. So everything you do, whether it's what you eat, what you drink, how you occupy yourself, what your disease burden is, whether you ski and you've broken every limb in your body, all of the things you choose to do whilst you're alive can leave a mark on you somewhere. And it's our job to try and find those, because sometimes it's that little thing that says, did he have a tattoo on the right-hand side of his forearm? And if that's the case, that may be the thing that goes, yes, he did. Did it look like this? Yes, maybe it is your son. So we need every single piece of information that most people may think is not important. We need everything. They're terribly nosy.
So how did you end up doing this for a living? Because it's not the most obvious thing that would come up, especially when you would have been at school. It was with.
That's a nice way of saying that. Oh, do you know, that's the most thing anybody has ever said. You're a baggage.
I was meaning programs like Silent Witness, must be, and CSI, they've all kind of awakened this huge interest in forensics, which wasn't really there when I was. So were you brilliant at puzzles? Was that how you got interested, or you end up? Did you just want a career in science that it was a spin-off?
I think as you get older, you get the confidence and you get the time to turn around and look at your life. And you can place different points in your life where there were crossroads and you made a decision. And whilst the decision in isolation, I think at the time, may not seem relevant or important, when you can put it in the context of others, you can see where you come from. So I was a daddy's girl. Everywhere my poor father went, I was his shadow. And I'm sure, to his great chagrin sometimes, but I just adored my father. And any opportunity I could to be out with him, I went. And my father was a great shot. And he would always shoot things for the pot. It was never for sport. So I would go out with my father while he shot rabbits or pigeons or pheasant or whatever it would be. We're talking wilds of Scotland here, so there's a lot of space to go out and do that. And so from a very young age of 4 or 5, I think nothing about carrying home the dead rabbits or the dead pheasants. And my mother was a bit squeamish, so she wouldn't do anything with them. So I had an opportunity to sit at the back door with my father. My father would teach me how to skin a rabbit or how to pluck a pheasant, or a good Scottish word, how to grulloch a deer, which is to take all the innards out. And so young age never thought anything of being up to my elbows in blood and guts and dead animals. Perfectly normal, because I've got to be there with my dad, and then my mother would cook it. And so when I was 12, classic Scottish Presbyterianism, my father said to me, what job are you going to get? And I thought he meant when I grew up. He meant, no, at 12, what job are you going to get? Because as far as my father was concerned, there were 7 days in the week. 5 of them you were in school, 1 you were in church. That left a good day to do something, and you shouldn't waste it. What were you going to do? So I needed to get a job. And it seemed logical to me to get a job in a butcher shop. And so all of my teenage years with my friends selling makeup in a pharmacy, or blouses in a fashion store, I was in a butcher shop up to my elbow in bloods and guts, and loved every single moment of it. And the reason my father said you had to work was A, it kept you busy, but B, he expected me to give half my earnings to my mother for board and lodgings. You try that with the kids now, see how far you get. And so it was expected of me. So I thought I needed to do something I was comfortable with and I loved. So that's what I did. And then when I went into my secondary school, I had the most marvelous biology teacher who I just idolized. And he had said to me, when you go to university, and I didn't know what university was. None of my family had ever been to university. I didn't know why you would go. But he said I should go. And if he said it, I was going to do it. And so I went to the university that was 2 hours away by train, which meant my mother could never surprise me by just turning up on the doorstep. But it also meant if things went wrong, I could get home really quite straightforward and easy. And my first 2 years, I had no idea why I went to university. It was doing things that just didn't capture my interest at all. And then in 3rd year, you had to specialise. And there were 2 things I was quite good at. We'd done some anatomy, looking down a microscope at cells. And I was good at that, and I was good at botany. And I thought, well, I'm either going to be a botanist or an anatomist. And I thought I'll do the grown-up thing, and I'll go and I'll speak to the tutors, and I will make an informed decision. Well, the trouble was the botanist that I chose was the most boring man on the planet. And I thought, I don't want to be like him. That is not the reason to choose your future career. And I thought, I'll go into anatomy. And when you go into the dissecting room in an anatomy department, you cross a Rubicon. And you're never the same once you've gone into that room, because you then start to learn, are you comfortable with death? Are you comfortable with the human form? Are you comfortable with putting a scalpel blade on and cutting into human tissue? You can't go back. Once you've done it, you're changed forever. And for me, it was like another butcher shop. It was a different animal, but I was still up to my elbows in blood and muscle and bones. And they'd said to me, it will take you a whole year to dissect the human body. And I thought, well, that's ridiculous. You should be able to do that in an afternoon. But once you cut through and you start to see the intricacies of human anatomy, you don't learn it in a year, it takes you a decade. And I really, at that point, felt at home. So I've always felt at home with the dead, whether they were animals or whether they were human. They hold no fear for me at all. I didn't want to go into the side of anatomy that was working on mice or rats or something like that, because I don't like them. I'm kind of scared of them, I must admit. So I had to do something that allowed me to do the human side of anatomy, but I wanted to do something that I felt made a difference. And so I spoke to when I got to the 4th year, I spoke to all the tutors, and I just couldn't imagine myself doing any of the projects. And my supervisor, the woman who became my supervisor, said, why don't we look at human bone? And we'll look at identification from human bone. I thought, I can do that. I can do that. And then they gave me funding for a PhD, and I didn't know what a PhD was and why not anybody would ever do a PhD. But it was in the middle of that that the first case came into my department. And you've got to bear in mind that this was in the early 1980s. So it's before DNA was used in a forensic sense at all. Wasn't until the middle of the 1980s that Alec Jeffreys in Leicester had that eureka moment when he was pulling his hair out. He doesn't have much hair anyway, bless him, but he was pulling his hair out, thinking, why can't I get my medical experiments to work? And that was when he had the moment of thought, it's because everyone's DNA is different. And it's so sensible and logical to us now. But to Alan, it was that eureka moment. And that introduced an entirely different world to us. But I was operating initially just before that. So it was a young man who was flying a microlight off the east coast of Scotland, and it crashed into the sea. And his body wasn't found for a couple of weeks. The couple of weeks in the North Sea wasn't in a very good condition when he arrived. He had no hands because they had fallen away. You get animal marine activity, and his head had been very badly damaged, whether that was because of waves on the rocks or whether it was passing ship propeller, whatever it may have been. He wasn't identifiable from his face or from fingerprints, and we didn't have DNA. So the police said, is there anybody in the anatomy department who could help with identification? My supervisor and I went along, and I thought, okay, I can do the butcher shop, I can do the dissecting room. Can I do a mortuary? Can I do something where the remains are much more recent and where the stakes are very different? And once again, it's another Rubicon. Once you cross that, it either works for you or it doesn't. And I found that I stopped thinking about what was in front of me and thought about the puzzle. What was my job? What did I have to do? And so we could identify him as male, we could calculate his height, we could identify his ethnic background, and we could identify his age.
This is all from bone.
This is all from bone and the bits of tissue that we had. And so everything fitted with a missing person. And what we noticed was that he had a birthmark just under his left nipple. And we said to his mother, we've identified all of this, and he has a birthmark. And she said, no, my son's perfect. My son has no birthmark. And we thought, blast. Okay, so maybe mom isn't the right person to ask. So we asked his girlfriend, and his girlfriend said, yeah, of course he's got a birthmark underneath his, not with that amount of glee, I have to admit. But she said, yes, he has got a birthmark underneath his left nipple. And that's very much a warning that says you need to ask the right question of the right person. The outcome of it was that the procurator fiscal, which is the equivalent to the coroner, was prepared to release the body, identified as being that individual. His girlfriend accepted it, but his mother never did. She never accepted that was her son. She always thought he was going to come home because her son was perfect. This person with a birthmark wasn't her son. And that's really important because part of our job is to give back the confidence to someone that says, it is your son, and I'm really sorry it's your son, but you're living with a false hope that he's going to come back. And there's a cruelty in a false hope. We actually want to tell the truth. So we've, from that point forward, I would say in this country, forensic anthropology was very much about how do we improve the science? How do we improve the methodology? How do we become certain that what we're saying is true? Because we needed to get to a point where mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters have a confidence that we're coming back with the truth. And now, of course, we have DNA. So that a lot of that's been taken away from us now.
The whole process you go through, I know, is hugely respectful towards either the human remains that you found or the person who may still have flesh on their bone. And you treat them very much like you would do if they were alive in the way you interact with them. Why is that so important to you?
So everything from the anatomy department, if you think about the anatomy department, people choose to bequeath their bodies to allow you as a student to learn. Nobody is ever going to give you a gift like that again. When somebody is alive, they think, when I'm dead and gone, I can learn. And there's no money changes hands. It is an altruistic sense of ensuring that doctors, dentists, and scientists can go on to learn. So every anatomy department is absolutely immersed in dignity, decency, and respect. And quite often in the anatomy department, I would have people come in who wanted to bequeath their bodies. So you get to know them when they're alive. And, you know, the closer people get often to their own hole in the ground, the more they become pragmatic about their own remains. So I'd have a gentleman come into my office who, wanted to talk about, he knew that his end of life was coming soon. And he wanted, you know, to be able to figure out what we were going to do so that he could approve of it. And on the way out, I can remember he turned to me in a very broad Dundonian accent, which I won't do. But he said, "You know, lassie," he says, "I never thought someone as young as you'd want my body." And there's a huge amount of humour when you come to terms with your own mortality and you make the decision about moving forward. You can afford to do it. There's a huge amount of humour in what we do, but it's never making a fool of somebody. It's never disrespectful, but sometimes humour helps in the difficult situations. My bequeathal secretary used to sit outside my office, had, I think, the most difficult job in the university, in that she would speak to people who wanted to bequeath their body, and then sometime later she'd be speaking to the families who've just lost their dad or their mum. And I could always guarantee somewhere in that conversation I'd hear her laughing, because she'd say something that just helped to break the tension. And sometimes that's what you need. And I think I was most proud in my department that when it came to the university, did a vote. Out of all the departments in the university, my department was the happiest university department, and it's the one that had zero tolerance for bullying, harassment, or anything else. When you spend your life every day with death, you have a respect for life.
Your job is emotionally, I think, very challenging, intellectually hugely stimulating, but also physically, I suppose sometimes it's also quite demanding, depending on where you're going to carry out research.
Yeah, so as you get longer in the tooth, you start to create a team around you that's younger, and you can go, "Can you dig that hole, please?" And you get them to dig the hole, and then you can go in and have a look at what's in it. So, you know, physically, you become very savvy as to what you can do. Or when we were working on the war crimes, then you'd have a whole bunch of fit young men and women, you know, around you in the military, and you'd hand them a spade and you'd go, "Let me know how you get on." So physically you learn how to cope with it, but it can be very demanding, long days. So sometimes we'd be working 18, 20 hours in a day, because once you'd started the case, you couldn't stop. You had to keep going. So you need the stamina, not so much the physical strength, because you can get other people to do it, but you need the stamina, physical stamina, to be able to do it. It's emotionally draining, but you have to be very careful with that, because if you become emotionally involved, you're not an objective scientist. So it was a very dear friend of mine who was head of CID in Scotland, and I was about to start doing some difficult casework, and I asked his opinion on whether I should do it, and he said no, but he knew I wouldn't listen to him anyway. And he said, "Okay, I'm going to give you a bit of advice," and it was the best bit of advice I'd ever had. He said, "Don't own the guilt. You didn't cause this. You couldn't stop it. It's not your fault." And if you go in with that mindset, you know that actually it's not your problem. Your problem is you have to be the scientist. So your job is, where's the evidence? Find the evidence, recover the evidence, analyze the evidence, and present it, then walk away. It's not my job to find somebody guilty. It's not my job to investigate them. If you can compartmentalize your role within the team, emotionally, you protect yourself. It doesn't always happen, because sometimes if you're overseas, then family might be around you whilst you're exhuming the body, and then you do have to have the interaction. But most interaction is done by family liaison officers and the police. So we're one step removed from the raw emotion of a family. Intellectually, it's stimulating.
But when you're in Kosovo, for example, it's quite hard not to be encountering families or people who would have known the victims.
Yes, I mean, they don't want our sympathy. They want us to do our job. And so my chaplain that I had at Dundee always used to say to me, "There's no comfort to be had from soft words spoken at a distance." So we don't speak soft words at a distance. What we do is we assume that the people who are there want us to tell them the truth. We won't be brutal about the truth, but we will be honest about the truth. So we won't be graphic, but we will leave it very clear what has happened. And some can handle that better than others. But you always have somebody in your team that can be that liaison. It's not my job. Often I can be the liaison for my own team, but often not the liaison for families. So our team get affected as well. When we were in a particular site in Kosovo, they had taken the women and the elderly and the children apart from the men. And so the men would be killed in one place and the women and the elderly and the children in another. And they'd separated the children from the adults, and they'd made the children run through the field towards the adults, and they'd used the children as target practice. So we had a lot of deceased children. And that's always very, very difficult, especially, you know, if you're a mum, it's difficult. And I can remember we had to walk, at least 2 hours into the wilderness to get to the site. So we knew that we couldn't take the bodies out to do the postmortems. We literally had to do the postmortems in the field on sheets of plastic on the ground to recover the evidence. And I can remember I had a little girl in front of me. She must have been about 2 or 3. And she was still in her little red wellies, and I could still see her sleep suit. And I was suddenly aware that in front of me was a whole line of Wellington boots. And I thought, what earth's going on? And I looked up, and it was all policemen that had just formed a sort of barricade around me. And what had happened was one of our officers had made the mistake of transposing his own daughter's face onto the little girl. And he was losing it, so he was breaking down. And the police's response was to shield him and to create this barrier. And for me, that didn't work. So I stopped what I was doing, took my gloves off, took that horrible Teletubby suit off, wrapped it around my waist, go around the barricade, you throw your arms around his neck, let him sob his heart out. And that's what we can do for our team, is to be the safety valve that allows them to let that grief out, allows them to come to terms with it, and really just be almost the counsellors for our own team. We don't do that for families. I feel that's a very specialised job. But in our team, we know what that person's going through, and nobody else ever will. I always say these teams are a bit like Big Brother, in that, you know, you'd never choose to live with these people ever, but you're in a difficult environment with them for sometimes 2 months at a time. So you've got to get on with them. And in doing that, you find a level of friendship that nobody else can understand, because they're the only people who experience that with you, and they trust you, and that trust is really important. That was a really long-winded answer to the question. I talked too much. I'm so sorry.
It's so fascinating, and so the picture you paint is just so emotional, so tragic, and I know people will be wondering, I'm sure, whether you're involved in any consultancy where you kind of know don't talk about anything that you'll be doing in this current, so we won't dwell on that. But you did get involved in the fallout of the Arab Spring, didn't you, in Syria, where a lot of men had died, and you were told it was natural causes, and then you're flown out.
So
to Doha, was it?
Yeah, it was to Doha. So sometimes the casework that we do is a little bit unusual. It's not the norm that you would expect. And I got a phone call from an international law firm that said, we'd quite like you to go out to Doha to look at some images. And you think, I don't know who you are. Why on earth would I, do this? I said, look, we're going to have tickets for you at Heathrow Airport. If you just pick them up, we're going to take you out. Government, and you say, listen, I've been approached by these guys, are they dodgy? What's it about? They go away and they do the search, and they go, okay, we're not going to tell you what about, but it's okay, you can go and do it. So I picked up these tickets from Heathrow, not sure really where I was going, then realised that it was to Doha, and we were being retained by the Qatari government. And what the Qatari government wanted to do was to prevent Assad giving attending a meeting, one of the UN meetings, I can't remember which one it was now. And so there was a political motivation for it, but that's not my business. That's for politics. What they wanted to know was the images that they had, were they legitimate images? And so there was a police officer who worked in the Syrian police, and his job was to photograph those who died in the Syrian detention camps. And the bodies were taken from the detention camp to abandoned warehouses, and the bodies were laid out in lines, and his job was to photograph them. And each body was given 2 numbers. There was one number that was written across their forehead, and they had to photograph the face and the number. And that was a number that linked to a false medical record. So they would take the face of the individual with the number, show it to family and say, terribly sorry, he died of a heart attack. He died in a car crash, but there was never any damage to the face. And then there was a second photograph that was taken of the full body, and the full body showed the full extent of torture that the individual had gone through. And they had a second number written on their chest, and that number related to the detention camp. So this was proof that an order had been given to torture this individual, and the photograph was proof that it had been done. But the second photograph was, of course, a lie about saying to families that this is what had happened to them. When you looked at the images of the torture, it was all torture is inhuman, but it really wasn't human. And it's out there in the press because the entire report was, I think it was reported by the Guardian. So it is all out there. But they wanted from us, are these photographs legit, or are they doctored in any way? The photographer decided he wanted to abscond. So what he did was he took copies of all the photographs that he did, which was a very brave thing to do. And he would smuggle them out every night in a USB in the sock of a shoe, so that even if he was strip searched, they never took his shoes off. So every night he took out the USB with the photographs. He would hand them over to a middle agent who would then get it out of the country. And then they faked his death. So even his family thought he was dead, and they got him out of Syria. And he was only ever known by his operational name, and he was known as Caesar. So when we arrived in Doha, we had to interview Caesar, and he stayed in a different safe house every single day. So we would go in a different car by a different route to a different house every day. And we would sit and we would look through these thousands of images of torture victims to say, does anything look staged? Are we seeing the same individual in multiple images? What sort of torture are we seeing? So it's myself and a pathologist. And we came out with the statement that actually these are all legitimate. The lawyers were there to determine, was Caesar a credible witness? We were there to say, were the images credible? And he was both a credible witness and credible images. And they were then used to stop Assad being able to become a member of that particular UN conference or committee. I can't remember which one it was, but it's all out there in the news. So strange things, like that happen. And, I was flown out there because, my job is my job. And I've never flown first class before. So it's rather nice, I have to say. But I just got over a bout of inner ear infection. So I had labyrinthitis, so I couldn't drink. So I sat in first class having water and bread. It was extremely acceptable. And then when you get to Doha, they say, would all first class passengers please stay on board? And you think, oh, that's interesting. I wonder what happens. And it's because there's a limousine comes for every first class passenger. And so I went to leave. They said, no, could you please wait? And I thought, I knew it. Everybody else is going to get the limo, and I'm going to have to do the walk of shame all the way to the airport. And my limousine had the foreign minister in it. So I was picked up by the foreign minister. Extra special. They took my passport. I never left the car. They checked me into the country. They found my luggage, and I never left the car. And I think, I never want to travel any way ever again. But that was my only once in a life. So there was a benefit in there. Actually.
This girl who's skinny rabbits and going up. One day you're going to be in a first class carriage on a plane, and
and the price was we had to do this really difficult job. But the price doesn't buy you. The price buys your expertise. And my view is my view. And no amount of whatever anybody provides for us as frippery on the side is ever going to make any difference. And that's what I liked working with that team. We came to our opinion, and nobody tried to change our opinion, fortunately. If they had, we wouldn't.
The truth is so important.
Absolutely. And the minute you don't tell the truth, you can never be trusted again. Because trust is one of those things that where there's doubt, it flies out the back door, and you're suddenly left with nothing. So truth has to come before anything else.
How much do you think you need to go through relates back to the story you write in the book about when you were 9 years old and you were sexually abused by a lorry driver? Your parents ran a hotel and had a bar, and there were people bringing deliveries. And you're sexually abused by a lorry driver who tells you if you tell anyone, they won't believe you. So you don't tell anyone until later on down the line you do tell you who doesn't believe you.
I know, it's amazing. So my mother was very sheltered, was my mother. And I think I was about 18 when I finally said to her, like, yeah, I need to tell you something. And I told her, and she said, oh, rubbish, nonsense. You know, that didn't happen. And she said, if it did, I bet it was him. And I just remember feeling such a sense of injustice, because the man that she said had never been anything other than kind to me, the man that she named, which was not the man who was responsible. And although the incident of itself is something that unquestionably molds you, it had nothing to do with me going into the world of forensic science, nothing at all. And the cases that I started working on child sexual abuse didn't happen till I was well into my 40s. So I can honestly say there's a sterile corridor between my experience and what I do for a living. But what my mother did by accusing somebody incorrectly, that I couldn't cope with. And I still hold that men who are accused of child abuse and they are innocent of it, what a sentence we give them, because you can't escape from it. Your family will always question you, your friends will always question you, even though you're innocent. That stigma, that stain stays with you. So I'm a very, very firm believer that you retain everybody's anonymity until they're found guilty. You are innocent until you're found guilty. But the minute you name somebody in a child abuse case, then you give them a sentence, whether they're guilty or not. And I think that's wholly unfair.
You have to go to court to give evidence in cases, even though you are clearly fabulous, hugely competent, the top of your field. You really don't like going to court.
I hate the courtroom. I hate lawyers. If there's any in the room, I'm so sorry. My youngest daughter is a trainee defence lawyer, so we're ashamed of her. I'm telling you. It's because the courtroom has its own rules, and they're not my rules. I can only play by their rules, and we have an adversarial courtroom system. So one side of the courtroom wants to find you the world's leading expert, and the other side of the courtroom wants to prove that you're an absolute idiot. And one of them is going to win. And I've been both. I've been an expert and an idiot. And as a scientist, when you go into court, the only thing you have is your reputation as a scientist. And every time you're in court, you run the risk of leaving it behind. So you take, for example, Sir Roy Meadows, who went into court, a paediatrician who didn't understand statistics. And he talked about shaken baby syndrome. And he gave evidence in court that was incorrect because he didn't understand the statistics. That was his fault in many ways, but it was compounded in the courtroom. So, you know, he was at that point struck off from being able to practice. He's become a court case that everybody quotes. He could never work again in his life. He got something wrong, but you get something wrong in such an open environment that it can be the end of your career. Every time you go into court, you think, is this the last case I'm ever going to do? Because I'm going to be proven today to be the fool that some lawyer is going to want to have a go at. So you try really hard, but a lawyer will come after you in 3 ways in the courtroom. The first thing they will do, which is exactly what they should do, is come after you on the evidence. So what is it you found? What is it you said? Pass it up. And that's where they should actually hammer away at you, because that's where you'll find the flaws in the system. If they can't get you in the evidence, then what they'll do is they'll come after you in procedure. And I've seen a court case collapse on the basis of cross-examination of an expert. And it was an expert who spent some time looking down a microscope. And the defence lawyer said to her, so how many hours did you look at it? She said, oh, I looked at it for, it must be well over 20 hours. he went, no. How long did you look down the microscope? And she went, I don't know, it was over 20 years. I said, sorry, but your job as a scientific expert is to record everything. And so surely you must record when you went to your microscope and when you came off it. And if you didn't, then you're not a very good scientist, are you? And she then started to panic. And eventually she agreed with him that she wasn't a very good scientist, which was so not true. She was a good scientist. She just hadn't filled out all the bits of paper. And I wouldn't have answered it that way. I'd have answered it a different way. But I saw the case collapse because they came after her in terms of her process and procedures. Did you sign that piece of paper? Why didn't you sign it? Don't you know that you should sign and date every single bit of paper? Don't you know that you should put a line through when there's a space at the bottom of the page? Those kinds of things. And bear in mind, sometimes in a court case, it can take you 10 years or more after the investigation before you're answering the questions. And if they can't get you on process and procedure, they'll come after you personally, which is why you'll never find me on Facebook or Twitter or anything else. Because what a law firm will do is they will say to their trainee, don't tell me what you can find on social media about this person. And if out there's a photograph of you sitting on the pavement, worse for wear, they'll go, really? Is this the professional level of you as an expert? I had one court case where in Scotland you need corroboration, which means that you say something that somebody else must see it as well so they can corroborate your opinion. And so I was working the case with a very young trainee. And when it came to his time in court, and it was a very good defence lawyer, one of my nemesis, he really is darn good. And I thought, oh, I pity my poor junior, but he's going to be blooded, he's going to have to learn. And so the question that came to him was, so, what is your relationship with Professor Black? And he said, well, she's my boss. I mean, it's a bit more than that, isn't it? And he said, well, she's my PhD supervisor. Anyway, come on, you know it's more than that. And he said, I could feel my face getting red because I felt he was insinuating something improper. And he said, but then I realized I was looking guilty because I'd gone red. He said, I started stammering like a fool. And he just had him totally off guard. And that was the whole intention. So in the courtroom, you're on trial personally and professionally. And that's a really difficult place for a scientist to be. Your wits have to be around you at all times.
So, don't like lawyers,
No.
but you do like human bodies very much.
Yes.
Our bodies, I learned this from Lucy's book, our bodies renew themselves every 50 or so years, don't they? Apart from 4 parts.
Yeah.
So tell us about this.
So by and large, you do not look now the way you did the day you were born. And that's because everything just renews itself as it grows. And even as you reach full adult, it keeps changing. Your skin keeps changing. Your body keeps aging. Cells die off. Bits get replaced, sometimes by good bits, sometimes by bad bits if they're cancerous cells. So your body does not stay the same. But there are some parts of you that do. And these are cells that you're born with that never change. So for example, the cells that you have in your central nervous system, you are born with as many those brain cells as you're ever going to have. So, there's a real worry that if you lose too many of them, perhaps by too many pints of beer or whatever it may be, they're never going to grow back. So, we know that you have a finite number of those, but fortunately, you usually have enough of them to see you through your life. So that's good. So they are the cells that you're born with. The same with the cells that form the teeth, so that your teeth don't regenerate. If they did, we wouldn't have to go to the dentist. So that those cells are laid down and they never change. If they die, then the tooth dies and you can't regenerate it. The cells that are in the lens of your eye, again, when they degenerate, then there's nothing to replace them. So these are all cells that when they do eventually die, you hope there are enough other cells can cope. But there's a bit of your body, the fourth one, which is fascinating. And it's a little bit of bone that sits right in the base of your skull. And it forms around your inner ear. And it forms around your inner ear when you're a fetus inside your mom. And that bone protects your semicircular canals, which give you balance, and your cochlea, which is what gives you hearing. And they're fully formed in size from day one. So when you're growing, they develop to full size. So we put a little capsule of bone around them to protect them. And that bone doesn't remodel, which is really interesting. Now, if we look at the cells that are in that bone was made with the nutrition that your mother was eating when she was pregnant with you. So when we're looking at the cells of the body, we can look at your bone and tell where you were living, roughly, in the last 10 to 15 years. We can look at the hair, and we can look at the nails, and we can tell where you've been living in the last few weeks, months, or years. Or we can look at the little otic capsule and tell you where your mother was living when she was pregnant with you. And that's the basis of the fact that your mother is always inside your head. You can never get them out of your head. She's literally in there. I just love the fact that whatever my mother was eating at that time is still there.
And there, we assume that biologically there are differences in male and female bone structure skeleton when we become adults. And in the more gender fluid times that we live in now, would it be the case if somebody had transitioned, so had been born biologically male but transitioned to female, would anything make any difference to their remains when they were found? Could you tell that they had been transitioning, or would they always be a skeleton? Would it always be male?
So if you go back to the older textbooks, it only ever says male or female. It was bimodal, and that was it. And methodology was determined around that. So how you determine whether a skeleton is masculine or feminine was based on those old texts that told us this is what happened. I don't think we largely fully understood at the time what happens, because there's no doubt that there is a genetic basis to sex. We know that because we have two X chromosomes and an XY chromosome. And we're really starting to learn what happens when those different chromosomes, different genes switch on and switch off. And what they do is they modify what happens in your body as you're growing up. So you might have a genetic sex, but that doesn't mean that your body isn't producing large amounts of testosterone or larger amounts of estrogen, because you're really just a biochemical soup, is what you are. And what's going on in your system can be largely determined by genetics, but it is largely biochemistry as well. And we know that if we play with biochemistry by introducing hormones, then we can induce differences. And that's the whole basis of some means of transgendering, is that you will take different hormones to produce a different end effect for the individual. So we're aware always that biochemistry is in many ways a really important element. So the bimodal male and female is so outdated in many ways, even in terms of our understanding of biochemistry, let alone the fluidity of our life, that now we will not make any assumptions. So that when we find a body, and it's very clearly in what we would expect to be feminine clothing, external and internal, we will not make the assumption anymore that that's a female individual. It's certainly someone who is presenting in a feminine form. If there is enough soft tissue, the presence of breasts and the absence of a penis doesn't tell you, because in terms of surgical means, then we can alter the appearance. So even being able to see external genitalia doesn't confirm what you would assume to be a particular gender. Even when you look internally, and we can see internally, there's a uterus and there are ovaries, there is no doubt that biologically and genetically, that individual at some point has had the signals to create these tissues. But how they choose to leave them is entirely different, third almost set of variables. And I just love the fact that the human form can express itself in so many different ways, genetically, biochemically, and culturally. And we have to be able to adapt to that. Sometimes it's not appropriate to say, we think the skeleton is male, because if we've missed any evidence of feminizing in some way, we want to put somebody down the entirely wrong track. So we can't do that anymore. All of our evidence now is based on the fluidity that we know that society currently has. So what used to be a really easy question to answer because we were wrong is now a much more complicated question to answer, but much more interesting.
Certainly, contentious in lots of ways, I suppose.
It can be, but we're always trying to get back to the identity of the person. And if the identity of the person for us is a name, it's not their identity, it's the gender identity or the age identity or the ethnic identity. We will use that as indicators. What we're trying to get back to is a name. Because if we've got the name, then we can investigate. So for example, if you have a body badly decomposed, out in the wilderness, no circumstantial evidence, we've got to try to bring everything together to say, what's the most likely that this person could be? Is it more likely they're masculine or feminine? Is it more likely they're tall or short? Is it more likely that they've got a particular ethnic background? And we might reconstruct a face that will go out onto the media because we're just trying to find that clue. It's like trying to unravel a jumper. You know, you need to find that first little bit of wool to be able to pull it out. We're just trying to get the first clue. And if we can get that, we'll follow that. Does it take us to the right name? It's not the right name. So we'll go to another one and to another one. And eventually our hope is you get to the right name. We don't have any sort of involvement in what the person's life was or how they chose to live their life. We're just trying to use their body to give us all the clues we need to get back to their name.
You're president of St John's College.
Only recently,
but
I'm a newbie.
But as an anthropologist, the first one, what a place to end up, because
this is my last job, is it?
There were a load of Vikings in the grounds that nobody seemed to know about. So some building work was carried out. And then for this Christmas, the Royal Institution Christmas Lectures, you reconstruct the life or who this person may have been from the remains of the skeleton. And we talk about reconstructing a face. This is the first time someone has constructed a face for a skeleton that you'd worked.
So the Royal Institution, for me, those are the lectures that I watched as a child. The one that I did some amazing sort of physiology lectures, and I could remember he had this sort of mad hair. I thought scientists don't have to be boring, and I thought he just sort of stuck with me. So when they came along and said, "Would you do them?" It's a huge honour, really a huge honour.
And I was a daddy's girl as well. I used to watch them.
Then so did I. And so they said we wanted to do 3 lectures, and Jonathan Van Tam did them the year before. And he broke the mold because he was aware that at any point he could be called back during COVID. So he fronted the lectures rather than giving them, he fronted them. And so I wanted to do the same. I wanted to front the lectures, but I wanted the information to be given by the other experts in different fields. So in the first one, we decided we would look at the body. What can you tell from the body? And the second one was, what can you tell from the crime scene? And the third one was, how does it go in the courtroom? And so the first one was the body, and it was one of the staff in St John's who had the brilliant idea, saying, you know, when we were building the Kendrew Quad for student accommodation, you know that we found a mass grave. No. And the mass grave, I think it was in 2008 they found it, and this related back to the year 1002, which was the St Brice Day massacre. And Ethelred the Unready put out an edict that said all Danes living on English soil should be killed. And so the people in Oxford hounded the Danes out of Oxford into one of the churches, burnt the church around them. And as the men were fleeing out of Oxford, they felled a number of them. And where they fell was where they were buried. So they were put into a mass grave on St John's land. So we found that the skeletons were at Whitley, the Oxford Archaeological Trust. So we went along to have a look at them to see, did I have a skeleton that I could use in the Royal Institution lectures? Because let's face it, I was trying to curry favour with St John's. If I could get my college onto the Royal Institution Christmas lectures, then maybe they would sack me at the end of the year. So I thought I was onto a good number. And we found this amazing skeleton. And so what we did, and you could feel it in young people in the room, when you start the lecture, it's just a bag of bones. And they just look at it as this dead and inert thing. And right the way through the hour, we started to build up. Was he likely to be male or female? Well, he was obviously quite masculine. How old was he? He was probably only about 19. And that really shocked, you could hear the sort of shock in the room, because they realised this person actually wasn't that much older than them. Once we started to look at the composition of the bone, we could detect that there were Scandinavian influences, and the DNA would confirm that for us. And that fitted because we knew this was the St. Brice Day massacre. So we could tell them quite clearly these were Danish individuals. And then it came down to what was the cause of death. And interestingly, he'd had a massive injury to the back of his head, but it wasn't on that day because it was partly healed. So he'd clearly been in battles before then. He was still only 19 years of age, but he was pretty well built, I have to say. There's strong sites of muscle attachment there. So he had that injury and he'd survived it. But we noticed just on the edge of it, there was a little mark. And then we found another one very similar, just on the left-hand side of his vertebral column. And when we went to the Royal Armoury, they could produce the bodkin arrows. And the bodkin arrows had exactly the same profile. So he certainly took an arrow to the back of his head. And I think the one that probably felled him was the one that went into his neck. So we could have a cause of death for him. And then I brought in my colleague, Geraldine, who's the most amazing scientist and artist combined. And we asked her to reconstruct his face for us. And so it's that moment in the room where everybody knows the story. They know he's a young man. They know how he died. They know when he died. And very rarely do they have a date, because I mean, we actually had the physical date of the death. And then suddenly you reveal the face and you feel the room change, because now they can see him. Now they can relate to him. He's no longer just a pile of dry bones. He's a person. So what we've done is we commissioned a piece of art, and we're having this three-dimensional reconstruction of the face brought back to the Kendrew Quad as a piece of art in St. John's. And there is going to be a day at St. John's looking at the St. Brice Day massacre. But there's an even more spooky part to the story, which I'm not going to tell you. No, because we're going to reveal it on the day of the St. Brice, on the St. Brice Day. We've got something even more spooky.
Well, I can tell you, one of my friends, Dan, sitting back there, he'll be going, we're on that. We're going to be coming down from Radio Oxford and finding out what's going on.
Because it is outrageous what happens.
It's his assumption that you can reconstruct the life and the face of someone who died 1,000 years ago.
No, we don't know we're accurate. Of course we don't know we're accurate. But what we do know is that when we do this in forensic cases and we solve the forensic case, we can look at how reliable they are. And some of the reconstructions Karen Wilkinson done are just incredible. From a skull, you get a face that is sufficiently recognisable for someone to say, I think that looks like. And that's all you're trying to get to, is a likeness. What we don't know is the ones that we don't solve. Have we not solved them because we didn't do a proper reconstruction, or as good a closer reconstruction as we could? Or was it just somebody who couldn't be identified? Maybe nobody has registered them as being missing. Maybe we're not hitting the right geographic area, or whatever it is. So we don't always know whether we get it right or not. But when we do get it right, we know we get it right really well.
So you'd expect in your job, faces and hands, they're the things that you see every day, aren't they? And that heads pop up a lot in the in the stories that you tell. There is one story about the head in the shed, which you didn't written in bone.
Okay, so quite often a case will become, it has its own number and its own operational name, but it becomes a name of a case that people remember. And it was always for us the head in the shed case.
It is an extraordinary story.
So a lady walked into a local police station, I won't say where. She walked into the police station and said, if you go and look under this patio, you'll find a body. So the police went, we better go and have a look under the patio. And so they went and they had a look under the patio, and we were brought down whilst they were doing the excavation. And indeed, there were skeletal remains under the patio. And the story was that the lady who'd come into the police station used to go in and look after an elderly lady who was in the flat. And she said she came in one day and the old lady had died. And so I didn't know what to do, so I thought I'll bury her in our back garden under the patio. And so we lifted the patio stones and we looked at it and we went, well, that's great. Where's her head? To which the police said, well, maybe you've missed it. No, we haven't missed it. You know, we do this for a living. Trust me. If there's a head there, I'd find it. I found the hands and I found the feet. Trust me, I'd find the head. There's no head. And they went, okay, we better go back and ask him. So they went back and asked him and said, so the head isn't with the body. He said, no, couldn't bury her head. So I cut her head off and I put it in the shed. And it was in a plastic bag in the shed. And every time I moved house, I took her head with me. So because the body was buried, she couldn't take the body with her, but she did take the head with her. And we said, well, why would you do that? She said, well, I didn't know what else to do. When you look at it and you came back and they looked at the story, the lady who had gone to the police station had been claiming the dead old lady's pension for a very long time. Now, what we could also find was that there was some trauma to the back of the skull, but it was difficult for us to tell whether that trauma was caused at the point of death or afterwards while she was trying to remove the head. It was very difficult to tell. So she was certainly charged with concealing a death, concealing a body, desecration of the body, all of those sorts of things. But I don't believe she was accused and convicted of murder or manslaughter, but various other charges. And so, you know, if you wrote that in a novel, no one would believe it. So what happens in the reality of life? Sometimes you just have to suspend reality.
Yoo-hoo!